A Roman governor washes his hands of a local execution, forced into a corner by an angry crowd. It is one of the most widely recognized moments in human history. That image of the reluctant judge cemented Pontius Pilate directly into the bedrock of Christian theology. Every week, millions of people recite the Nicene Creed, and in that foundational text, he is the only human being mentioned by name other than Jesus and Mary. Yet Pilate was an obscure, mid-level provincial manager. He ruled a small territory on the edge of the empire for just 10 years. Somehow, that brief assignment secured him a permanent mythic status that eclipses nearly every emperor who ever sat on the throne of Rome. To understand the myth, we have to look at the man. Secular historians from the 1st century, like Josephus and Philo, describe a ruler who looked nothing like a hesitant, easily pressured politician. They recorded a ruthless, uncompromising imperial enforcer. Archaeological proof of his rank exists. In 1961, excavators uncovered a limestone block bearing a Latin inscription, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. He wasn't sent to mediate religious disputes, but to extract taxes and run a heavily armed police force to crush dissent. The historical record is entirely unambiguous about how he operated. He deliberately provoked his subjects by smuggling offensive Roman imperial standards into Jerusalem under the cover of night. Later, when a mob protested his decision to drain the sacred temple treasury to fund an aqueduct, Pilate ordered his soldiers into the crowd to beat the protesters to death. In fact, Rome eventually fired him. After he violently slaughtered a group of Samaritans at Mount Gerizim, the empire recalled him to answer for excessive brutality. The real Pontius Pilate was too brutal for the Romans, which leaves us with an obvious question. Why did history rewrite an iron-fisted killer as a victim of circumstance? The answer lies in the geopolitical survival strategy of the early Christian church. They were trying to grow a brand new religious movement inside a Roman empire that actively hunted down and executed anti-imperial rebels. This timeline compares the 4 canonical Gospels, and it shows a clear strategic shift. In the earliest account, Mark, Pilate works in agreement with the local crowd. But as we move forward in time to Luke and then John, the writers progressively minimize the Roman governor's agency. They portray him repeatedly declaring Jesus innocent and trying to let him go. By transferring the guilt away from the empire and onto the local Jewish authorities, early Christians created a story that was much safer to preach inside Roman borders. But this political compromise laid the theological foundation for centuries of anti-Semitic persecution. The character of Pontius Pilate was not rewritten to preserve an accurate historical record. He was rewritten to ensure early Christians survived the 1st century. In the Eastern Roman Empire, this apologetic view of Pilate evolved rapidly. Through a vast collection of apocryphal texts, the story of the reluctant judge was pushed to its absolute extreme. Early literature emerged claiming that Pilate actually converted to Christianity. In these texts, he writes formal letters to Emperor Tiberius defending Jesus, takes the blame for the crucifixion upon himself, and is ultimately beheaded by Rome for his new faith. This narrative arc reached its ultimate conclusion when Pilate was literally canonized. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church venerates him as a saint and a martyr. For Eastern traditions, Pilate proved that even the empire's executioner could recognize divine truth. He became the ultimate symbol of the penitent pagan. When we shift geographically to medieval Western Europe, the narrative fractures in the exact opposite direction. Here, Pilate was transformed into a monstrous, cursed entity. The Western legends dictated that an enraged emperor forced Pilate into suicide. According to the myth, his demonically cursed corpse was repeatedly thrown into rivers across Europe, only for the water to violently reject his body. The folklore finally deposited his body in an isolated alpine lake in Switzerland, near Mount Pilatus. For centuries, locals believed his restless spirit was responsible for causing supernatural storms in the area. This villainy was institutionalized as public entertainment. Medieval passion plays used Pilate as a theatrical scapegoat, frequently dressing him in the robes of a stereotyped Jewish king to satiate the local anti-Semitic biases of the audience. Medieval Europe needed an outlet for its own religious anxieties. They actively erased the actual Roman bureaucrat to create a supernatural monster tailored to their specific fears. Moving into the 20th century, Secular literature stripped away the religious mysticism entirely, but authors kept Pilate around as a potent political allegory. In the 1930s, the Russian author Mikhail Bulgakov wrote the novel The Master and Margarita. Within its pages, Pilate is characterized as a man completely paralyzed by his own cowardice within an authoritarian system. Bulgakov used the Roman prefect as a direct psychological stand-in for the spineless provincial bureaucrats operating in Stalinist Russia, men who knew what was right, but were too terrified to challenge the state. Modern society reinvented Pilate to reflect a highly specific 20th century anxiety, the moral complicity of the middle manager trapped in a corrupt totalitarian regime. It is an incredible historical paradox. A minor official governed a difficult province for 10 short years and generated 20 centuries of completely contradictory global legends. Pilate's actual historical reality was erased because humanity desperately needed a blank slate. We took a Roman enforcer who never hesitated to use violence and reduced him to an image of a man washing his hands. To build empires, religions, and political movements, society literally washed its hands of the real Pontius Pilate, replacing him with whatever myth the present moment required. When a perfectly ordered system encounters an anomaly that breaks its internal logic, the system must either expand its rules or reject the data entirely. Modern academic historiography is a highly ordered system. Within this discipline, a settled, secular consensus exists regarding the first-century existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Despite centuries of scrutiny, secular scholars universally agree on 3 bedrock facts. The man existed, he was baptized by John the Baptist, and he was executed by crucifixion under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Historians secure this consensus by intersecting biblical accounts with external, non-Christian primary sources. Records from Roman historian Tacitus and Jewish commander Josephus act as external pillars, grounding the subject in a verified time, place, and historical reality. To study these events, academics employ methodological naturalism, a framework requiring historians to explain past events through exclusively natural causes and observable human behavior. This boundary allows the discipline to confidently reconstruct the mundane details of the Jesus of history, while structurally forbidding the investigation of the supernatural Christ of faith. This creates an immediate tension. The same discipline that uses these ancient texts to verify a man's execution must determine how to process claims of a physical resurrection that violates the known laws of physics. Analyzing the resurrection forces a collision between 3 incompatible epistemological frameworks, mutually exclusive methods for determining what constitutes a historical fact. The first framework originates with the 18th century philosopher David Hume and his 1748 essay of Miracles, which provides the dominant filter for modern historiography. Hume established a rigid axiom. A miracle is, by strict definition, a transgression of an unalterable law of nature. Evaluating any claim of a miracle requires the historical principle of evidence, a mathematical weighing of competing empirical claims to determine the most probable. This visualization maps the competing variables in Hume's framework. On one side, the uniform laws of nature. On the other, human testimony. A physical law is established by massive, exceptionless experience. Billions of observations confirm dead bodies remain dead. Arrayed against this mass is human testimony, which is susceptible to misperception, mistransmission, credulity, and deliberate deception. Because testimony is fragile and physical laws are constant, Hume concluded it is always more probable that a human witness lied or was deceived than that the laws of physics were suspended. Mainstream historiography integrates this roadblock into its core methodology, making historical proof of a miracle structurally impossible before any physical evidence is even examined. The minimal facts argument acts as a methodological counterattack designed to bypass Hume's barrier. This strategy attempts to force a supernatural conclusion using exclusively the secular data that modern historians already accept. It relies on 4 universally agreed-upon pillars. First, a crucifixion, the initial appearances, the conversion of skeptics, and early attestation. This matrix illustrates how historians validate these points. The first gate is the criterion of embarrassment. All primary accounts name women as the first witnesses, a detail so detrimental in a patriarchal culture, it suggests a recorded fact, not an invention. The second gate is enemy attestation. Hostile leaders claimed the disciples stole the corpse, a response that inadvertently verifies the tomb was physically empty. The third gate is early attestation. Scholars trace the 1 Corinthians 15 creed to within 3 years of the crucifixion, mapping it on a timeline drastically predating standard myth development. The framework also highlights the unexpected conversions of historical opponents like Paul and James, who joined the movement after claiming they interacted with the risen subject. By combining immediate, early data with hostile witnesses, this approach attempts to dismantle naturalistic theories of swoons, contagious hallucinations, or delayed myth-making. The minimal facts framework argues that, given this verified data, denying the resurrection requires more historically absurd leaps of faith than accepting the miracle. Scholar N.T. Wright offers a meta-historical critique, claiming that the entire modern historical apparatus is rigged by unacknowledged philosophical assumptions. Wright asserts that modern historiography operates on an Epicurean substructure, a specific philosophical bias inherited from the Enlightenment. This Epicurean worldview requires a rigid architectural separation between a mechanical material universe and an absentee divine realm. This modern bias is deeply incompatible with the first-century Jewish temple cosmology of the texts being studied. Temple cosmology functions on the overlap of heaven and earth, treating them as interacting dimensions, with the physical temple serving as their intersection point. Wright highlights a significant historiographical error. Historians who process a temple cosmology text through a rigid materialist lens fundamentally mistranslate ancient claims to satisfy modern prejudices. In this view, modern historical critical methods are not objective readers of ancient texts. They are rigid filters that automatically disqualify any data suggesting a cosmic overlap. If you shift the external light sources surrounding a stationary object, the object's identity appears to warp and change, even though its physical structure remains perfectly still. The primary historical sources, the non-Christian citations, and the physical geography regarding Jesus of Nazareth remain completely static. The radical divergence in conclusions is generated entirely by the epistemological lens applied to the data. The limits of mainstream history are clear. It can objectively establish the man, the crucifixion, and the birth of the movement, but it cannot process the anomaly. To evaluate the resurrection, a viewer must choose between Hume's probabilistic rejection, the minimal facts logical bypass, or Wright's cosmological paradigm shift. Raw historical data never speaks for itself. Extracting a miracle, or dismissing one entirely, requires the historian to step outside of history and choose a philosophical axiom.